And how about Glenn Beck? You know, every time I listen to Glenn, I learn something. He's an educator. He's a teacher. I love it when Glenn brings out his whiteboard. When he walks through the perils of progressivism. When he lays out the principles of the founding, the principles that built this great nation into a shining city on a hill. And Carly and Glenn and I, we are all here for one singular reason, and that is to support our friend, Mike Lee. I want to take this chance on behalf of 27 million Texans and on behalf of 330 million Americans to thank the people of Utah for sending Mike Lee to represent you in the United States Senate. I know this man. I know this man in the way that can only be hardened in the heat of battle. That can only be hardened when incoming is coming from every direction. And I'll tell you, when I think of Mike, I think of three words: principle, courage, and accountability. You know, Mike and I first met back in November of 2010, just a couple of weeks after he'd been elected to the Senate, in a shock, upset election that nobody thought was possible. And he'd been elected, he wasn't yet sworn in. And we were both in D.C., and I came and visited with him and told him I was thinking of running for Senate. And we proceeded to spend 2-3 hours talking together, actually walking through the basement of the United States Capitol, walking and talking about the Constitution, walking and talking about freedom, about the principles that built this country. And I got to say, we were immediately brothers. One of the things we talked about was at the time there'd been a recent study that estimated the value of all of the land in America owned by the federal government at $14 trillion. Now, at the time, the United States national debt was $14 trillion. And to both of us, there seemed a rather elegant and simple solution. Remember the days when we just owed $14 trillion? Oh, those were the days. Look, what's $5 trillion between friends? But as we walked the Capitol and talked, I discovered this is a man who loves the United States Constitution. This is a man whose copy of the Constitution is well worn, whose the corners are bent, who the words have been read over and over again. Any of y'all seen Lord of the Rings? You know Gollum? For Mike, the Constitution is my precious. This is a man who was raised at the dinner table as the son of Rex Lee. One of the greatest United States Supreme Court advocates to have ever lived, a lion of the law. And Mike, as a child, their dinner conversation concerned the Constitution, concerned the principles of liberty. Mike is a man of deep, deep principle. And that in the United States Senate is extraordinary. More than once, there are moments with our colleagues where they turn to him and say, in effect, "What is this Constitution of which you speak?" Or, as Nancy Pelosi responded when asked where in the Constitution is the authority for Obamacare, and she responded, "Are you serious? Are you serious?" "Yes, Nancy, we're serious." But the second critical aspect that Mike brings is courage. And it's all fine and good to be principled. But principle with a spirit of fear does nothing. Principle hiding in the back room scared of your shadow does nothing. Principle, when it is married with courage, yields action. And Mike Lee is a man who doesn't know how to run away from a fight. It is not in his personal constitution. It is not in his DNA. I'll tell you, I've seen his car. His car doesn't have a gear for reverse. In fight after fight after fight in Washington. Washington says surrender, says give up, says you cannot stand, you cannot fight. Republican leadership says stand up to Obamacare. To Obama, you got to be kidding. And Mike's response is boo. You know, I remember the summer of 2013 when Mike and I traveled the country, speaking to rallies all over the country, energizing and mobilizing millions of Americans to stand up to the disaster that is Obamacare. Washington didn't like that. I remember standing for 21 hours on the Senate floor, filibustering the disaster that is Obamacare. And I'll tell you, for every minute of every hour of those 21 hours, Mike was standing by my side on the Senate floor. Now listen, I will admit, 21 hours, long time. You know, a bit of advice that our friend Rand Paul gave beforehand. Rand said he had just done a long and tremendous filibuster. And Rand said two bits of advice. He said, number one, wear comfortable shoes. Rand did not do that. He said his feet hurt for 2 weeks afterwards. And Rand also said, don't drink a lot of water. Let me tell you, that is very good advice. But the way the Senate rules work is you cannot sit, you cannot lean, you cannot leave the Senate floor. That's why not drinking water is a really good idea. By the way, legend has it that Strom Thurmond, during his extended filibuster, utilized a bucket in the cloakroom. But I will say, in the age of C-SPAN, that did not seem a wise choice. But you are allowed to yield for a question. So the Senate rules allow someone to yield for a question without yielding the floor. And then often people will step up and they'll help save your voice by standing and asking a question that is 20, 30, 45 minutes, and then they end their 30, 45 minutes with, "Don't you agree?" And so multiple times, particularly in the dead of night, Mike would stand to ask a question, and I would gratefully yield and stand by the side and stretch my legs. And I remember 2 or 3 in the morning, Mike gave a 45-minute extemporaneous lecture on Wickard against Filburn, a U.S. Supreme Court decision that dramatically expanded the authority of the federal government. Now, it was as learned and erudite as any law professor in any law school in America has ever given. And he had no notes. He wasn't reading from anything. He was just standing there because, you know, in the Lee household, what you talk about at the dinner table is Wickard against Filburn. You know, when James or John or Eliza says, "Pass the bread," Mike says, "Well, you know, bread is made from wheat. And did you know the history of wheat in America?" There has not been a constitutional scholar in the United States Senate with a depth of understanding of the Constitution, with a love of our founding principles, since Daniel Webster served in the United States Senate. The third characteristic I think about Mike is accountability. Listen, every one of us knows Washington is broken. It is fundamentally broken, and the biggest divide we have in politics, it's not between Democrats and Republicans. The biggest divide we have today in politics is between career politicians in Washington in both parties and the American people. And there is an urgency to politics today. Unlike anything any of us have seen before, our freedom is at stake. Our nation is dangling in the balance. And it's because Washington isn't accountable to the people. They go to Washington, they get elected, and they stop listening to us. You hear that from Republicans, from Democrats, from independents, from libertarians. They're not listening to us. The most important role Mike Lee plays, not just for Utah, but for the whole country, is helping hold Washington accountable to we the people. It is not easy to stand up to the Washington establishment. They have all sorts of tools that they utilize. They utilize ridicule and attacks. Mike and I have sat through Senate lunch after Senate lunch after Senate lunch where senators all around the table yell and scream. I still remember one of our colleagues in one of the battles literally made a fist, pounded the table, and said, "My constituents keep calling me." I think it's the only time I've ever seen Mike speechless. What do you even say to that? But the Washington establishment They respond with ridicule. They respond with attacks. They respond by trying to zero out your money. That's part of the tools of the establishment.